By the autumn of 1944, the Pacific War had become a contest over operational reach. Which side could keep aircraft, fuel, and shipping moving across long sea lines while denying the same to the other? In June 1944, U.S. carrier forces and land-based aviation fought Japan in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, and Japan's naval air arm lost many trained air crews. From that point, Japanese planning increasingly treated land-based air power as the first line of defense, while the carrier fleet was preserved for a decisive engagement under conditions chosen as carefully as possible. Taiwan, known internationally then as Formosa, sat at the center of that defensive geometry. Under Japanese rule since 1895, the island had been developed into a major military and logistical complex, linking the home islands to the Philippines and the South China Sea. Ports such as Takao, Kaohsiung, and Keelung, rail lines running down the Western Plain, and multiple airfields around Taihoku, Taipei, and central and southern Taiwan made it a natural base for fighters, bombers, anti-aircraft units, and supply depots. For Japan, it was both a shield for traffic moving south and a forward platform from which aircraft could contest U.S. advances toward the Philippines. For the United States, Formosa had a different meaning. It was an airfield system that could interfere with an invasion of the Philippines and, if left intact, could support sustained attacks on landing forces, transport convoys, and fleet units operating east of Luzon. In Washington and at Pacific headquarters, the near-term objective in October 1944 was to isolate and weaken Japanese air power in the approaches to the Philippines before major amphibious operations began. That required not only destroying aircraft on the ground, but also forcing Japanese air units to fly and fight, consuming trained pilots, fuel, spare parts, and serviceable airframes that Japan could no longer replace quickly. These intentions shaped the balance of forces. The U.S. Third Fleet, under Admiral William F. Halsey, with Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher commanding the fast carrier force, brought Task Force 38 into the Philippine Sea, with a carrier air arm of roughly 1,000 aircraft, organized around 9 fleet carriers and 8 light carriers, supported by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers for anti-aircraft defense and screening. Japan's defenders were a composite: Imperial Japanese Navy and Army Air Services distributed across Taiwan and nearby regions, with aircraft staged on Formosa itself and additional units expected to reinforce from Kyushu, Japan, and other bases as the situation developed. Contemporary U.S. assessments and later accounting placed several hundred Japanese aircraft immediately available on Formosa, with larger totals committed over multiple days through reinforcement flights and redeployments. Command arrangements added another layer of complexity. U.S. carrier task groups could concentrate quickly, launch large strike packages at dawn, and recover aircraft onto moving decks, an advantage in tempo and coordination. Japanese aviation operated from fixed bases with established maintenance facilities and the possibility of dispersal, but it also faced constraints. Runways and fuel stores were targetable, radar and communications were uneven, and pilot quality varied sharply after earlier losses. Japanese planners nevertheless expected that mass land-based attacks, especially torpedo and night strikes, could reach U.S. ships, and they treated the approach of TF-38 as a potential opening to damage carriers and set conditions for a larger fleet action connected to the impending battles around the Philippines. On the island itself, civilians experienced these preparations as both mobilization and risk. Air raid drills, blackouts, and the expansion of anti-aircraft defenses affected daily routines, while wartime labor demands pulled workers into ports, airfields, and storage sites that were likely targets. For Japanese military authorities, protecting infrastructure and sustaining sortie generation were priorities. For Taiwanese civilians and Japanese settlers alike, the approach of sustained air attack raised practical questions about shelter, medical capacity, and the continuity of food and transport in an economy already tightened by wartime rationing and shipping shortages. Against this backdrop, the Formosa Air Raids were not an isolated episode, but a hinge between campaigns. They were designed to reshape the air situation in the northern Philippines corridor immediately before the landings at Leyte, while Japan viewed the same fighting as a test of whether it could still use land-based air to impose costs on U.S. carrier forces. The next phase begins when Task Force 38 closes to launching distance and the first pre-dawn fighter sweeps rise from carrier decks toward Taiwanese airspace in mid-October 1944. In early October 1944, the U.S. Third Fleet shifted from preparation to execution. Task Force 38, organized into multiple fast carrier task groups with their own escorts, moved west of the Philippine Sea toward positions that allowed daylight strikes against targets across a wide arc: the Ryukyus, northern Luzon, and Formosa. The operational problem was timing. Amphibious planning for the Philippines required an air environment in which Japanese aircraft could not mass effectively against the landing force and its supply chain. Carrier raids were used to compress that risk into a short window by hitting airfields, fuel storage, and maintenance capacity, while forcing defensive air units to take off and fight. On October 10, 1944, carrier aircraft struck Okinawa and nearby islands in the Ryukyus. This served two purposes. It reduced the chance of Japanese aircraft staging from those fields into the Philippines area, and it tested Japanese reaction patterns, including radar reporting, fighter direction, and the tempo of reinforcement flights. The attacks also signaled that the carrier force intended to operate within range of land-based air, accepting the possibility of counterstrikes in exchange for reaching the airfield network that supported Japanese operations. As the fleet continued south and west, successive strikes expanded to northern Luzon on October 11th. Airfields and shipping targets were attacked with the same logic: reduce the immediate ability to contest sea control near the Philippines and map out which bases could still generate sorties. For Japanese commanders, these strikes created an urgent identification problem. The carrier force could reposition overnight, and the sequence of targets did not yet reveal whether the main effort would be against Luzon, Formosa, or a wider set of staging fields. Japanese staff work therefore emphasized rapid reporting, dispersal of aircraft when possible, and attempts to assemble strike packages large enough to reach the carriers at sea. Formosa became the central focus on October 12th. From the U.S. perspective, the island's airfields represented a concentration of runways, fuel, and repair facilities that could support attacks into the Luzon Strait and the approaches to the Philippines. The first wave of strikes typically began with fighters sweeping ahead to reduce interception, followed by dive bombers and torpedo bombers carrying bombs and rockets suited to parked aircraft, hangars, revetments, and airfield infrastructure. Targets were distributed across northern, central, and southern Taiwan, including airfields near Taihoku and along the Western Plain, and port installations that supported military logistics. For Japanese pilots and ground crews, the opening hours were shaped by the warning system and the condition of aircraft on the fields. If warning time was short, aircraft could be caught in maintenance lines or refueling areas. If warning time was longer, aircraft could be dispersed to satellite strips or camouflaged revetments, with crews prioritized to get fighters airborne for interception. The defensive response also depended on fuel availability and the ability to coordinate Army and Navy aviation elements that did not always share identical communications procedures or tactical priorities. The air battle over Formosa quickly became a layered engagement. U.S. fighters sought to break up interception attempts and protect strike aircraft over the targets, while Japanese defenders tried to reach the attackers before bomb runs began, or to attack returning aircraft when fuel states and formation cohesion became limiting. Each side interpreted losses through its own reporting system. U.S. strike leaders and fighter squadrons submitted claims based on observed crashes and fires. Japanese units recorded missing aircraft and pilots, often with incomplete confirmation when engagements occurred over water or cloud layers. The first day, therefore, produced both measurable effects on airfields and a parallel contest over information, in which both commands attempted to determine whether the opposing air force had been reduced decisively or merely displaced. The opening phase also extended beyond daylight. Japanese doctrine and necessity pushed toward counterattacks against carriers as soon as strike forces could be assembled, from surviving units or from reinforcements flying in from other regions. That introduced additional variables: long overwater navigation, the need for accurate contact reports on moving carrier groups, and the ability to coordinate attacks through darkness or weather. For U.S. ships, this meant that the raid was not only a daytime strike operation, but a continuous defense problem with combat air patrols, radar-directed fighter interceptions, and anti-aircraft readiness maintained through the night. On the island, civilians experienced the opening strikes through alarms, visible aircraft activity, and the immediate effects on transport and services near targeted areas. Airfield-adjacent communities and port districts faced the highest exposure, while authorities focused on maintaining military operations, clearing damaged runways, and controlling movement around installations. For Taiwanese civilians and Japanese residents, the first raids clarified that Formosa was no longer a rear area supporting distant fronts. It had become a direct battlefield in the air, with outcomes that would influence what happened next around the Philippines. By the time the carrier raids were authorized, both commands treated the coming fight as a planning problem as much as a flying problem. How to turn limited information into correct choices about where to concentrate aircraft, fuel, and attention. For U.S. commanders, the operational goal was not territorial control of Formosa. It was to reduce the effective striking power of Japanese land-based aviation that could reach the Philippine approaches during the Leyte operation. That goal translated into measurable tasks: crater runways and taxiways to slow sortie generation, destroy aircraft on the ground and in the air, and damage the support system that kept planes returning: fuel dumps, bomb storage, repair shops, and communications nodes. Carrier Doctrine by 1944 emphasized tempo: large morning strikes, rapid deck cycles, and repeated attacks on the same fields to defeat rapid runway repair and aircraft dispersal. In practice, the plan required enough fighters to maintain combat air patrol over the fleet, while also escorting strike groups and sweeping airfields ahead of the bombers. Task Force 38's organization supported that approach. The fast carriers were split into task groups so the fleet could launch from different points, cover multiple target sets in a single day, and complicate Japanese tracking of the carrier's exact position. Each group carried its own screening ships and used a layered defense: radar pickets on the perimeter, cruiser and battleship anti-aircraft fire near the carriers, and fighters directed by shipboard radar and fighter direction teams. The air plan was built around three main aircraft roles and their constraints: F-6F Hellcats and a smaller number of F-4U Corsairs provided fleet defense, sweeps, and escorts. SB-2, C Helldivers, and TBM, Avengers delivered bombs and rockets against airfields and port facilities, and reconnaissance aircraft searched for shipping and assessed damage. Every choice forced a trade. More planes over targets meant fewer over the fleet if Japan launched counterstrikes, while heavier bomb loads meant shorter range or reduced fighter cover. Intelligence shaped the target lists, but did not remove uncertainty. U.S. planners used a mix of photo reconnaissance, signals intelligence, and combat reporting from earlier raids to estimate how many aircraft were on Formosa, and how quickly Japan could reinforce from the home islands and the China coast. Those estimates mattered because the raid was intended to be a prelude to a larger operation, not an end in itself. If Japanese losses were decisive, the late landings would face fewer massed air attacks. If losses were limited or quickly replaced, the carrier force would have to keep returning or accept higher risk to the amphibious shipping. Japanese planning framed the same days differently. Formosa was a base system in a defensive corridor running from the Ryukyus through Taiwan to Luzon. Its value lay in geography and infrastructure. It sat astride routes to the Philippines, and its airfields could project fighters and bombers into the Luzon Strait and over the Philippine Sea. In late 1944, Japanese strategy also tied air operations to a broader attempt to fight a decisive engagement against U.S. naval power during the expected invasion sequence. That meant air units were tasked with two simultaneous missions that competed with each other: defend the bases on Formosa and strike the carrier fleet at sea. Those missions exposed structural constraints. Japanese Army and Navy air arms operated in parallel, often with different aircraft types, maintenance practices, and command channels. Coordinating interception, anti-aircraft fire, and long-range strike assembly across multiple fields required reliable communications and early warning. Radar coverage existed but was uneven and vulnerable to jamming, weather, and the destruction of key stations. Even when warnings were timely, the practical bottleneck was sortie generation. Aircraft needed fuel and ammunition delivered to dispersal areas, engines and airframes kept serviceable, and pilots briefed with enough navigation and target information to find moving carriers over open water. Japanese counterstrike planning faced additional technical limits. Strikes against carriers demanded accurate contact reports, disciplined formation keeping, and long overwater navigation, tasks that became harder as experienced aircrew numbers declined and as U.S. fighters and anti-aircraft defenses improved. To compensate, Japanese planners emphasized mass. Assemble large waves from multiple bases and accept losses in order to put a smaller number of attackers through to release points. That logic also encouraged reinforcement flights to Formosa once the raid began, because even aircraft that arrived late could contribute to night attacks, follow-on strikes, or the defense of neighboring sectors. Civil defense and economic considerations ran alongside these military plans. Formosa's ports, rail lines, and storage depots supported not only air units but also the wider movement of supplies between Japan and the southern front. Military authorities, therefore, had to decide what to protect first: aircraft assets, fuel reserves, or transport links. For civilians, the same priorities meant that areas around airfields and ports, places tied to wartime employment and ration distribution, were also the most likely targets, and disruption there could quickly affect food delivery, medical care, and evacuation capacity. In effect, both sides entered the next stage with plans that depended on time. The U.S. sought to compress Japanese air power before Leyte by striking repeatedly and forcing fighters into battle. Japan sought to absorb the first blows, keep enough fields operating to sustain interceptions, and turn the carrier's presence into an opportunity for counterattacks that might alter the larger campaign's balance. Before dawn on 12 October 1944, Task Force 38 began the operation with fighter sweeps designed to arrive over Formosa around first light. The sequence was deliberate. Fighters went in ahead to reduce interceptions and to disrupt takeoffs, followed by strike groups tasked to hit runways, dispersal areas, hangars, fuel points, and port installations. Because Japanese air units on Taiwan had been placed on alert, the first contacts occurred early. U.S. fighters encountered interceptions over multiple sectors, with the densest fighting reported over northern and central Taiwan, where several major airfields lay within short distance of each other. The initial engagements followed the geometry of air defense. Japanese fighters tried to meet the sweeps before bomb runs began, aiming to force escorts to break formation and to create openings over the targets. U.S. fighters attempted to keep the airspace over the airfields under pressure so that Japanese aircraft would be engaged climbing out, circling for assembly, or returning low on fuel. Over the first morning, air combat fragmented into multiple small actions: pairs and divisions chasing aircraft through broken cloud, others circling above airfields to intercept takeoff attempts, and escorts staying close to bombers as they began their attacks. Once strike aircraft arrived, the battle widened from air to air to a combined contest of damage and repair. Bombs and rockets were used against runway surfaces, parked aircraft, and support areas that enabled rapid sortie generation. Even when aircraft were dispersed, the limiting factor for the defenders became the condition of usable runways, the availability of fuel and ordnance at forward points, and the ability to keep maintenance crews working under repeated alarms. For the attackers, the limiting factors were time over target, fuel margins for the return to moving carriers, and the need to preserve enough fighters for fleet defense while air combat continued inland. Japanese command decisions during the first day reflected uncertainty about where the carrier force would remain and how long it would continue strikes. Some defensive sorties prioritized protecting specific airfields and ports. Others were assembled for longer-range attacks against the carriers themselves. This created a split effort. Aircraft committed to interception were not available for anti-ship strikes, while aircraft held back for counterattack risked being caught on the ground if additional raids arrived before launch. By afternoon and into the night of the 12th to 13th of October, the engagement shifted seaward. Japanese planners attempted to convert surviving and reinforcing aircraft into attacks against the carrier groups, including night approaches that relied on flares and radar-assisted navigation where available. For the U.S. fleet, this produced a different type of battle: radar contacts at longer ranges, combat air patrol fighters vectored into interceptions, and ships maneuvering to reduce the probability of torpedo hits while maintaining formation around the carriers. Anti-aircraft fire became a continuous requirement rather than a short defensive burst tied only to daylight strikes. On 13 October, U.S. carrier aircraft returned to Formosa and nearby target sets, continuing the cycle of sweeps and strikes. The cumulative effects on the island were uneven. Some installations were hit repeatedly, while others resumed partial operations through runway repair and dispersal. Japanese counterattacks, however, produced one of the first operationally significant results at sea. In the early evening, the heavy cruiser USS Canberra, screening the carrier force, was struck by an aerial torpedo, losing propulsion and requiring towing and a protective escort screen. The damage did not halt the carrier operation, but it imposed immediate changes in fleet handling, speed, formation, and the allocation of destroyers and cruisers to protect a disabled ship while still defending the carriers against further air attack. For participants on Taiwan, the first 2 days established the character of the campaign. Military personnel experienced it as a struggle to keep airfields functional under repeated strikes, while trying to assemble attacks against ships they could not directly see. Civilian communities near airfields, ports, and rail links experienced it as abrupt disruption. Alarms, fires, damaged utilities, and restricted movement around military zones. From the U.S. perspective, the opening engagements were measured by aircraft destroyed, runways cratered, and the degree to which Japanese sorties could still be generated. From the Japanese perspective, the same days were judged by whether enough aircraft could survive and concentrate to damage carrier groups at sea and preserve Formosa as an operating base for the battles expected to follow around the Philippines. By 13 to 14 October, the campaign shifted from a sequence of daylight strikes into a multi-day crisis of endurance for both sides. For Task Force 38, the key variable became not only the damage inflicted on Formosa's air system, but whether Japanese air units could still assemble coordinated attacks against carriers and escorts at sea. For Japanese commanders, the same days were defined by a race to regenerate sorties, repair bombed runways, move fuel and ordnance under threat, and bring in reinforcement aircraft from Kyushu, Japan, and the China coast, quickly enough to replace losses and keep pressure on the fleet. The tempo increased. U.S. carrier groups were flying on the scale of hundreds of sorties per day, with some operational summaries for October 13th, placing the total near 1,000 sorties against airfields and related targets. On Formosa, that pace forced a repeating cycle for defenders: scramble interceptions, absorb the strike, then attempt runway repair and aircraft servicing before the next wave. The strain fell heavily on ground crews and airfield troops as much as pilots. A runway could be reopened by rapid repair, but only if equipment, materials, and labor were available, and not disrupted by continued alarms or secondary attacks on dispersal areas and supply points. Japan attempted to answer with mass and persistence. Roughly 330 aircraft were assessed as available on Formosa, and about 350 in Kyushu at the start of the battle. And over the following 4 days, additional aircraft flew in from bases in Japan and China, expanding the total force committed. The practical effect was uneven. Reinforcement flights increased the number of aircraft present in the theater, but coordination and pilot experience were inconsistent, and long overwater anti-ship attacks demanded navigation accuracy and timely contact reports that were difficult to sustain under pressure. At sea, the escalation became concrete on the 13th of October when a torpedo attack struck the heavy cruiser USS Canberra, killing 23 and flooding critical engineering spaces, leaving her without propulsion. The immediate operational choice for the U.S. command was whether to sink a crippled ship that could not keep up or detach forces to protect and tow her, while the carrier operation continued. Canberra was taken under tow and screened by a newly formed group detached from the carrier task groups. The decision preserved the ship, but it also created a slow-moving formation that required fighter cover, destroyer screens, and constant radar vigilance, resources that otherwise would have supported the carriers directly. The crisis deepened on October 14th, when the light cruiser USS Houston was also torpedoed, taking on a significant list and losing speed. With two major ships disabled, U.S. fleet operations became a balancing act between offensive requirements and a withdrawal problem under attack. Carrier groups still needed fuel and ammunition replenishment for continued strikes and for the coming Philippines operation. Yet escort demands increased sharply. Combat air patrol had to be maintained not only over the main carrier groups, but also over the damaged ship formation, moving at towing speed. Japanese air attacks continued through night and day, in waves of varying size and cohesion. Some were organized torpedo attacks intended to exploit darkness and reduce fighter interception. Others were smaller contacts shaped by reconnaissance uncertainty and weather. For U.S. ships, defense became procedural and cumulative. Radar detections at range, fighter direction into intercepts, smoke screens, and high-speed maneuvering intended to defeat torpedo approaches. Anti-aircraft ammunition expenditure and crew fatigue rose as the hours without a clear pause lengthened. On Formosa, the escalation had a civilian dimension that tracked the military one. Port districts and rail junctions near airfields faced repeated disruptions as authorities prioritized restoring military movement over normal traffic. Firefighting, medical response, and shelter management had to operate within blackout conditions and intermittent air warnings. For residents near airfields, the pattern of the battle was less a single raid than a sequence of repeated shocks. Aircraft noise, nearby detonations, temporary loss of power or water in some areas, and the visible movement of military units and repair parties through civilian spaces. By mid-battle, the contrast between claimed outcomes and confirmed effects also became part of the operational environment. U.S. air crews reported large numbers of Japanese aircraft destroyed in the air and on the ground, while Japanese units reported heavy attacks on U.S. ships, including claims that implied major damage to carriers. Both commands had reasons to believe their own reports, at least temporarily. Pilots saw fires, splashes, and damaged ships. Headquarters received partial, delayed, and sometimes contradictory messages. The fighting therefore continued under a fog of assessment, even as cumulative losses mounted. Across 12 to 16 October, Japanese aircraft losses are generally placed in the range of roughly 321 to 525 aircraft, while U.S. losses were about 89 aircraft, alongside the serious damage to Canberra and damage to Houston. The escalation forced a decisive operational posture by October 15th. Task Force 38 could not remain indefinitely near Formosa while protecting disabled ships, refueling, and preparing for the Philippines. Japan, meanwhile, needed immediate success at sea to offset the rapid erosion of its land-based air strength. The next phase would test whether either side could convert pressure into a clear turning point, either by Japan locating and striking the carrier force decisively, or by the United States completing the suppression of the Formosa air system while extracting its damaged ships without losing the initiative. By 14 October, the operation reached its highest intensity because both sides were now pursuing outcomes that could be measured quickly. The U.S. carrier force needed a final reduction in Formosa's sortie generation before shifting attention back toward the Philippines. Japanese commanders, having already committed aircraft and suffered losses, needed damage at sea that would change the carrier balance before the next amphibious phase. Air operations peaked in two connected arenas, over the island and over the fleet. Over Formosa, U.S. strikes returned with the same structure: fighter sweeps, escorted bombers, and follow-on attacks, aimed at keeping runways closed long enough that repair work could not restore normal tempo. On the ship side, carriers had to keep enough fighters airborne to intercept long-range raids, including night approaches, while still launching offensive sorties. Every hour of flight operations increased wear on airframes and pilots, and every interception cycle consumed fuel, ammunition, and time on the decks. Japanese counterattacks were shaped by distance and uncertainty. To reach the carriers, attackers needed accurate position reports on a fleet that shifted course and speed and could be outside the predicted search box by the time strike groups arrived. Aircraft that did make contact then faced layered defense, radar detection, fighter direction, and concentrated anti-aircraft fire around the carriers and their escorts. The result was a repeated pattern. Some Japanese aircraft were intercepted before they could organize. Others pressed attacks against the outer screen and released torpedoes at escorts or cruisers rather than carriers. This still mattered operationally because disabling an escort ship forced the U.S. to redistribute destroyers and cruisers to screening and towing duties. The crisis at sea was now centered on the damaged ships. After USS Canberra was torpedoed on October 13th and USS Houston on October 14th, the U.S. command created a slow formation built around towing and protection. Canberra was taken under tow. Houston, damaged and limited in speed, moved under heavy escort. This group required its own combat air patrol and radar coverage, pulling fighter time and escort ships away from other tasks. At the same time, it offered a practical option. If Japanese reconnaissance reported only the damaged ship group, it could draw attacks away from the carriers. The U.S. response, therefore, combined protection with deception by maintaining a visible, slower unit while the main carrier groups maneuvered and continued strikes. For Japanese air units, this created a targeting dilemma. Attacking the carriers was the intended decision point, but contact often occurred on the slow group first. Torpedo bombers and level bombers that found ships at sea attacked what they could identify and reach. From their perspective, hits on large warships still counted as results, and reports could inflate those results as they moved up the command chain. From the U.S. perspective, each incoming raid demanded the same defensive sequence regardless of which ships were being targeted, because a single successful torpedo run could disable another escort and further complicate withdrawal. On Formosa itself, the peak of the campaign was experienced as cumulative disruption. Repeated alarms interrupted work cycles at airfields and ports. Repair parties worked to reopen runways, move aircraft between dispersal points, and keep fuel and ordnance distribution functioning despite damage to storage sites and transport links. Civilian services near major targets, power distribution, water supply in some districts, rail movement, medical response, were strained by the combination of physical damage and military control measures. For residents, the operational distinction between an airfield, a port facility, and a rail node mattered less than proximity. The areas with the highest military value were the areas most exposed to repeated attacks and restrictions. By 15th October, U.S. commanders had to integrate three constraints at once. First, sustaining a high sortie rate required replenishment of aviation fuel, bombs, and replacement aircraft, which depended on at-sea logistics and safe refueling windows. Second, the carrier force could not remain indefinitely within range of large-scale land-based attacks, while also protecting a slow-moving damage group. Third, the Philippines operation was approaching, and the carriers were needed to cover landings and to contest Japanese air forces from Luzon and the central Philippines. Japanese planning faced its own combined limits. Reinforcements increased the number of aircraft committed over several days, but each additional sortie consumed scarce pilot hours and serviceable airframes. Coordinating Army and Navy aviation elements under sustained attack remained difficult, and every failed anti-ship raid reduced the pool of crews capable of long-range navigation and coordinated torpedo tactics. The peak, therefore, became a threshold. Either the attacks at sea would yield damage that forced the carrier force to break off on unfavorable terms, or the continuing loss of aircraft and disruption of airfields would reduce Formosa's ability to influence the coming battles around Leyte. By the end of this phase, the operations center of gravity had moved. The U.S. carrier force had demonstrated it could strike Formosa repeatedly while defending against multi-day counterattacks, but it had also accepted the operational cost of 2 torpedoed cruisers and the escort burden that followed. Japan had shown it could still reach the fleet with some attacks, but the cumulative aircraft losses and airfield disruption reduced the capacity to sustain the same level of pressure as the campaign progressed toward its turning point. As the battle entered its later days, the core problem became adaptation, how each side adjusted tactics, resource use, and command procedures after the initial shock and peak intensity. For Task Force 38, adaptation centered on survivability without surrendering operational tempo. The carrier force maintained a dual air plan, offensive sorties against Formosa and nearby targets, and continuous fleet defense against long-range raids. That required stricter allocation of fighter hours. Combat air patrols were adjusted in altitude and distance bands to exploit radar warning and to reduce the chance that attackers could approach low and unseen. Fighter direction teams refined intercept procedures based on the previous night's experience, using radar tracks to vector fighters earlier and to concentrate them at likely approach corridors rather than dispersing them evenly. Strike tactics also adapted. As Japanese aircraft dispersal increased and some airfields reopened partially, repeated attacks emphasized the support system. Parked aircraft, revetments, fuel points, and repair facilities rather than runways alone. When weather or smoke obscured aiming points, strike leaders shifted toward area targets that still constrained sortie generation, such as taxiway junctions and servicing areas where damage could bottleneck movement even if the main runway was repaired. The goal remained consistent: reduce the number of aircraft that could take off, assemble, and return in organized cycles. At sea, adaptation had a distinct character. The U.S. created a dedicated protection structure around the damaged cruisers. Canberra, under tow, and Houston, damaged and speed limited, moved with a screen designed for torpedo defense and night warning. Destroyers were positioned for radar picket and anti-submarine coverage, while cruisers and battleships provided heavier anti-aircraft fire and command coordination. Carrier aircraft were used to provide daytime cover and to extend radar-directed intercepts outward so that attackers would be engaged before reaching torpedo release distance. This was a resource trade-off, but it prevented the damaged ships from becoming isolated targets and reduced the chance that additional ships would be disabled during withdrawal. Japanese adaptation focused on preserving what remained of Formosa as an operating base while continuing to seek effective anti-ship attacks. Dispersal became more systematic. Aircraft were spread across multiple fields and emergency strips, and servicing was moved to reduce vulnerability to single-point attacks. Where possible, sorties were timed to exploit periods when U.S. carriers were recovering aircraft, refueling at sea, or operating at night with limited visual acquisition. Japanese planners also attempted to refine reconnaissance and contact reporting. Without reliable location data, large strike packages could fly extensive searches and return without engagement, consuming fuel and causing losses through accidents and ditching, even without combat. Coordination remained a limiting factor. The separation between Army and Navy air commands meant that even when aircraft numbers were available on paper, combining them into coherent raids with shared timing, altitude plans, and target assignment was difficult. Some attacks therefore arrived as smaller packets rather than single-mast waves. From the U.S. defense perspective, this could be advantageous because fighters and anti-aircraft fire could deal with separate raids sequentially. From the Japanese perspective, it reduced the probability that enough aircraft would arrive simultaneously to overwhelm defenses and deliver multiple torpedo hits on high-value targets. Innovation and improvisation were also visible at the tactical level. U.S. ships used radar not only for warning, but for engagement control, vectoring fighters to intercept at distances that reduced the need for heavy anti-aircraft fire over the carriers, and using maneuvering doctrine to present less predictable torpedo solutions. On the Japanese side, pilots relied on low-level approaches, weather cover, and night tactics when possible, attempting to reduce exposure to fighters. These methods could increase survivability to the release point, but they also demanded navigation accuracy and disciplined formation work that were uneven in late 1944. The psychological and physical toll shaped decision-making for both forces. Carrier air operations required repeated launch and recovery cycles that stressed deck crews and maintenance teams. Sustained alert conditions reduced sleep and increase the probability of errors. For Japanese airfields, repeated alarms and damage repair created similar fatigue, compounded by supply constraints and the need to disperse personnel and equipment. Civilians on Formosa experienced the adaptation phase as a shift from acute shock to chronic disruption. Continued restrictions around bases, periodic raids, and uncertainty about transport and food distribution as wartime systems were redirected toward military priorities. By this stage, the battle's measurable outcomes were increasingly connected to sustainability rather than single dramatic events. The U.S. could maintain high sortie rates and protect its carriers, but every day near Formosa increased exposure and consumed resources needed for the Philippines. Japan could still mount raids and had inflicted serious damage on 2 cruisers, but each additional day brought aircraft losses and wear that reduced the ability to contest the next phase of the campaign. The turning point would depend on which constraint hardened first, whether Japanese air operations could still impose losses significant enough to force the carriers away, or whether Formosa's air system would be reduced to a level that could no longer influence the Lady operation in a decisive way. By 15th October 1944, the campaign reached a decision point, driven less by a single engagement than by the interaction of attrition, fuel, and information. The U.S. carrier force had demonstrated it could fly large daily strike totals while defeating repeated counterattacks, but it was now operating at the edge of 2 constraints: the need to replenish aviation fuel and munitions at sea, and the requirement to preserve combat power for the imminent Philippines landings. Japanese air commands faced a different constraint: the ability to keep generating coordinated sorties from Formosa as airfields, servicing areas, and aircraft pools were repeatedly disrupted, while long-range anti-ship raids consumed experienced pilots and airframes. The turning point emerged as Japanese attacks increasingly failed to connect with the carriers. At the moment when strikes could achieve high-value results, the operational geometry favored the defenders. A carrier group could change position overnight by hundreds of kilometers. An attacking formation, once launched, was committed to a search track shaped by imperfect contact reports and changing weather. If reconnaissance was late or inaccurate, a raid could arrive over empty ocean, then return with fuel margins tight enough that losses occurred through ditching or forced landings even without direct interception. This made the outcome depend on a chain of events: detection, reporting, launch timing, navigation, target identification, and coordinated attack execution. Breakdowns at any link reduced the probability of hits on carriers. U.S. fleet defense adapted to exploit that chain. Radar warning and fighter direction shifted interceptions farther from the carriers, reducing the chance that attackers could reach torpedo release distance in organized groups. Combat air patrols were concentrated along likely approach corridors rather than held uniformly over the fleet, while ships maneuvered to complicate torpedo solutions. These measures did not make the fleet invulnerable. 2 cruisers had already been hit, but they raised the threshold for success on subsequent raids. For Japanese air units, that threshold increasingly required massed attacks arriving nearly simultaneously, with enough surviving aircraft to press through fighters and anti-aircraft fire. The damaged ship group became a practical focal point in this phase. With Canberra under tow and Houston limited in speed, the U.S. could not treat the battle as only a strike mission. It became a withdrawal problem under threat. Protecting the slow formation required escorts, continuous radar coverage, and fighter allocation that otherwise would have been used exclusively for carrier defense and offensive strikes. From the Japanese perspective, the slow formation offered the most detectable and reachable target. Attacks that found it could claim results against large warships, even if the carriers remained beyond contact. Over time, this shifted the battle's center of gravity. Japanese effort was expended against ships that mattered, but not the ships that would determine the next amphibious operation. Over Formosa, the same turning point was visible in sortie generation. After repeated strikes, the defenders could sometimes reopen runways, but reopening did not automatically restore the capacity to assemble large raids. Fuel distribution, ordnance handling, aircraft serviceability, and pilot readiness became limiting factors. Even where aircraft numbers could be reinforced from outside the island, integrating newly arrived units into a coherent plan under ongoing attack was difficult, especially when different commands were operating in parallel. The result was that raids continued, but the pattern shifted towards smaller packets, less consistent timing, and fewer opportunities to saturate U.S. defenses. Information amplified the turning point. U.S. commanders evaluated success by whether Japanese aircraft were being removed from the order of battle fast enough to reduce the threat to the Philippines operation. Japanese commanders evaluated success by whether the carrier force could be damaged sufficiently to change the operational balance before the landings. Both sides received reports that were incomplete and sometimes contradictory. Pilots and ship crews saw explosions, smoke, and ships stopping or turning away, and could interpret these as larger outcomes than later confirmation supported. This mattered because decisions about committing remaining aircraft and repositioning forces were made under those reports, not under later reconciled totals. By 16th October, the U.S. decision was effectively made. The carrier force would not remain indefinitely within range of Formosa while escorting damaged cruisers and preparing for Leyte. The raids had reduced the immediate ability of Formosa-based aviation to mass against the approaching invasion route, but the cost of staying longer rose each day. For Japan, the same moment marked a narrowing of options. Continued attacks could still inflict losses, but the probability of achieving carrier-level damage before the U.S. shifted to cover the Philippines was declining as aircraft and trained crews were depleted, and as contact problems persisted. The momentum shift was therefore operational rather than symbolic. The battle moved from an open contest, whether Formosa could be used to blunt the next Allied step, to a more limited contest, how much damage could be imposed while the U.S. extracted its damaged ships and repositioned for Leyte. When the carrier groups began to open distance and refuel, the center of the air war followed them south and west toward the Philippines, where the next set of decisions would be made with whatever aircraft and pilots remained after the Formosa raids. As the last strike cycles ended in mid-October 1944, the operational question became how to disengage without turning withdrawal into another battle. Task Force 38 had spent several days operating within reach of large concentrations of land-based aircraft. Its carriers had to preserve air groups for the Philippines, while also covering damaged surface units that could not keep fleet speed. The most visible constraint was the towing problem. USS Canberra had lost propulsion after a torpedo hit and was taken under tow, while USS Houston, damaged and limited in speed, remained under heavy escort. A separate, slower formation was organized around these ships with destroyers and cruisers assigned to screening, radar warning, and anti-aircraft defense. Keeping that group intact required continuous fighter coverage and repeated course changes to complicate torpedo approaches. This was a redistribution of combat power. Aircraft hours and escorts that could have supported further strikes were instead committed to extraction and protection. Japan, for its part, faced a narrowing opportunity. Air units that still had serviceable aircraft and crews attempted to keep contact and attack as the U.S. force opened distance. The difficulty was structural. Attacks launched from Formosa or adjacent bases depended on reconnaissance updates against a fleet that could change position rapidly. When contact was late or inaccurate, strike groups either failed to find targets or arrived in fragmented packets. Those that did find ships encountered a defense system that was now fully oriented to protecting a predictable objective, the damaged ship group and the carrier screen around it. As U.S. carriers moved away to refuel and reposition for the Philippines, the air battle over Formosa ended not with a ceasefire, but with the fading of reach. The U.S. could sustain attacks only while accepting repeated counterstrikes. Japan could continue raids only while targets remained within feasible range and while fuel and sortie generation held. Once distance and logistics took priority, the operation transitioned into the broader campaign for the Philippines. On Formosa, the immediate aftermath was assessed in practical terms rather than strategic language. Airfields that had been struck repeatedly required runway repair, replacement of damaged servicing equipment, restoration of fuel distribution points, and reconstitution of aircraft strength through transfers from other regions. Even when runways were reopened, sortie generation depended on the availability of trained pilots, spare parts, and aviation fuel delivered through ports and internal transport links that had also been attacked or disrupted. Japanese commanders had to decide which fields to restore first, and whether to keep aircraft on the island or redeploy them toward the Philippines, where the next major battle was imminent. For civilians, the end of the raids did not mean an immediate return to normal conditions. Communities near airfields and ports faced the near-term tasks of firefighting, debris clearance, emergency medical care, and the restoration of utilities and transport. Movement controls around military installations continued, both for security and because repair work and the dispersal of aircraft and supplies remained priorities. The disruption of rail and port routines affected distribution of food and materials already constrained by wartime rationing and shipping shortages. The civilian experience was therefore shaped by proximity. Those closest to military infrastructure experienced the highest interruption, while other areas felt the effects indirectly through shortages and restricted transport. At sea, the U.S. Navy's immediate consequence was the diversion of time and escort strength to preserve damaged cruisers while maintaining readiness for the Philippines. Damage control and towing reduced operational speed and imposed predictable routes, which in turn demanded persistent air cover and increased fatigue for escort crews. The carriers, although not decisively damaged, had expended aircraft, fuel, and munitions at a pace that required replenishment before they could support the next operation at full capacity. Both sides also faced the problem of accounting. During the raids, air-to-air claims and ship attack reports were generated under combat conditions and often exceeded later reconciled totals. Post-action assessment required matching claimed shoot-downs with missing aircraft and claimed ship sinkings with confirmed damage. This mattered operationally. Decisions about whether Formosa's air power had been reduced enough, or whether U.S. carriers had been damaged enough to change Japanese plans, depended on figures that were only clarified after the fact. The immediate outcome was therefore mixed in form, but clear in direction. The United States completed the raids and withdrew with 2 cruisers seriously damaged but preserved, shifting its carrier strength toward the Philippines. Japan retained Formosa as a base, but emerged with reduced air strength and a repair and reinforcement burden just as the battle moved to Leyte, where remaining aircraft and pilots would be committed again under similarly compressed time and logistical pressure. The Formosa Air Raids of October 12th to 16th, 1944 became significant less as a standalone battle than as a connector between campaigns. They were fought in the interval between the U.S. carrier victories of mid-1944 and the amphibious landings at Leyte on the 20th of October, when both sides were trying to shape the air situation over the next operational objective. For the United States, the raids were a method to reduce the number of sorties Japan could generate from Taiwan and nearby bases into the Luzon Strait and the Philippine approaches. For Japan, the same days were a test of whether land-based aviation could still impose enough damage on fast carrier forces to change the balance before the Philippines campaign. Measured in operational results, the raids produced a recognizable pattern. U.S. carrier aviation flew large daily sortie totals and attacked multiple airfields, ports, and support sites across Taiwan, while maintaining continuous fleet defense. Japan attempted to combine interceptions with long-range anti-ship strikes and drew in reinforcement aircraft from outside Taiwan, expanding the number committed over several days. The most durable U.S. surface losses were not carriers, but cruisers. USS Canberra and USS Houston were torpedoed and taken out of normal operations, requiring a slow, heavily protected withdrawal group. On the air side, post-war reconciliation of combat records generally places Japanese aircraft losses in the hundreds over the 4-day period, with U.S. aircraft losses below that total, alongside the cruiser damage and associated casualties. Both sides produced higher claim totals during the fighting than later confirmation supported, reflecting the normal distortion of air-to-air and anti-ship reporting. Strategically, the raids contributed to the air balance at the opening of the Leyte operation. Even where runways were repaired quickly, the limiting factors became serviceable aircraft, fuel distribution, pilot availability, and the ability to assemble coherent strike packages with reliable contact reporting on moving fleets. Japan entered the Lady phase with fewer trained air crews and a heavier repair and redeployment burden. The United States entered with intact carrier strength, but with escort and logistics demands increased by the need to protect damaged ships and replenish after sustained high-tempo operations. The raids also sit inside larger debates about decision-making in late 1944. One debate concerns prioritization, whether concentrating several days of carrier effort against Taiwan was the best use of time compared with deeper focus on Luzon, shipping interdiction, or earlier concentration over the Philippine landing areas. Another concerns interpretation. Wartime U.S. narratives often emphasize destruction of Japanese aircraft on a large scale, while Japanese narratives highlighted hits on major warships and claims of heavier U.S. carrier damage than actually occurred. A third debate concerns the operational lesson both sides drew. U.S. forces refined radar-directed fighter defense and the integration of shipboard and airborne control. Japanese forces, facing declining probabilities of penetrating layered defenses with conventional strikes, moved further toward tactics that accepted lower survival rates in exchange for a higher chance that some attackers would reach release range. Within weeks during the Leyte fighting, Japan began organized special attack operations, which later became a defining feature of the final year of the war. For Taiwan's civilian population, the raids mattered as a transition point. They marked the beginning of sustained exposure of major military infrastructure on the island to repeated air attack, with effects that extended beyond immediate casualties. Disruption of transport and distribution, damage to utilities near ports and airfields, mobilization of labor for repair and dispersal work, and tighter wartime controls around targeted zones. In memory, this experience did not belong to a single group. It was shaped by Taiwanese civilians living near military sites, Japanese personnel and settlers tied to the colonial administration and garrisons, and U.S. air crews and sailors who experienced the same days primarily as sortie generation, radar contacts, and defense of ships at sea. In the longer view, the Formosa Air Raids illustrate the late war shift from battles over islands to battles over systems, airfields, fuel, maintenance, pilot training pipelines, and the ability to coordinate across distance. They did not decide the Pacific War on their own, but they influenced how the next operations unfolded by reducing Japan's capacity to contest U.S. sea control at a critical moment, while also demonstrating that Japan could still inflict serious damage on well-defended fleets. Their legacy is therefore dual, an example of carrier aviation used to precondition an invasion, and a case study in how air war attrition, logistics, and information quality could determine outcomes even when neither side achieved a single decisive tactical blow.